talks. So now I'm happy to introduce to you I'm Shogry from the University of Oxford. We're going to talk about the good, corporeality, and the perceptibility of.
Great. Yeah, thanks so much. And thanks again to Ricardo for the invitation. It's been a great conference, been a great few days. So thanks again. Really delighted to be speaking here and to get your feedback on this topic, which I began to explore when I was working on Stoic eros. And I think later in the talk, I'll be able to maybe make some connections there if necessary. But I was excited by the opportunity to dive a bit deeper into the ontology of this question, which I don't think I had the opportunity to do earlier. So I think there's a lot you could say on this topic, the corporality and perceptibility of virtue, and in general about what the Stoics think about the ontology of the good. But I'm going to try and focus on what I think are distinctly sort of issues from Stoic physics that might shed light on it, and try to reconstruct some of the reasoning from within Stoic physics that leads them to these conclusions that virtue is both corporeal and perceptible. And if there's other questions that arise, I'd be happy to talk about them in Q&A. So, by way of introduction, it's widely recognized that Stoic philosophy is systematic. An interesting case study is their account of the ontology of the good. As we will see, the Stoic thesis that the good is both corporeal and perceptible follows from their core commitments in physics, so their theory of human psychology in particular, and of corporality, causation, and the categories more generally. But additional confirmation of this thesis is provided using the distinctive resources of Stoic ethics and Stoic logic. This kind of systematicity is familiar to scholars of Stoicism, but in the conclusion of my paper today, I want to ask whether we can find a deeper systematicity in Stoic philosophy, such that the corporeality and perceptibility of the good is a conclusion required for the Stoic defense of moral realism and their defense of the possibility of objective moral judgment, which is a suggestion first raised in Long and Sedley. So at the end of the talk, I hope to raise the question about whether Stoic physics grounds what you might call Stoic metaethics. In other words, do their views about the existence and nature of existence of moral properties, does it depend on the perceptibility and corporality of the good? So before we get there, just want to start off with the corporeality of the good. So section 1 of the handout. So from Zeno onwards, the Stoics standardly make a threefold division of beings. Some are good, some are bad, some are indifferent. More precisely, according to DL 761, the Stoics first make a negative division of beings, dividing the genus into species by opposition. So of beings, some are goods and some are not goods. And then they make a subdivision of the latter species of not goods. Some are bads and some are indifferents. So I've represented that in our schema here. So given the fundamental tenet of Stoic corporealism, that all and only bodies are beings, it follows straight away that all goods are bodies if this division is sound. But as the corporality of the good is a highly controversial thesis, it's no surprise that the Greek Stoics develop further arguments in support. So just to give you a flavor of those arguments, Seneca records 2 of them. So if something acts, this is premise 1, if something acts, it is corporeal. If something benefits, it acts. The good benefits, so the good is corporeal. Another argument from letter 106, if something is corporeal, then the good of that thing is corporeal. The human is corporeal, so the human good is corporeal. So neither of these arguments, it seems, will be dialectically effective against a Platonist or peripatetic opponent, since these opponents posit incorporeal agents. Thus, they would reject premise 1, And they also see the incorporeal soul as essential to the person. Thus, they would reject 6. My interest today, however, lies not in how the Stoics could convince rivals to accept the corporeality of the human good. That's an interesting question in its own right, sort of as Bryan was touching on in his talk. Rather, my goal is to sort of reconstruct their own motivations for defending the corporeality of the good and in the implications they drop from it. And in these first 2 arguments we get from Seneca, I think you get a sort of basic sense of the kinds of motivations that the Stoics had. So that's about the corporeality of the good. But to better understand the thesis, we should think about which bodies the Stoics say are good. So this is section 2, the corporeality of virtue. So which bodies are good? According to one canonical account, the good is everything which either is virtue or participates in virtue. Analogously, the bad is everything which either is vice or participates in vice. So we will consider later which things participate in virtue. But for now, let's just focus on the contention that virtue is corporeal. So again, this would seem to follow from the soundness of the Zenonian division of beings that we began with, since virtue is good and good is a being. But it's also supported by explicit Stoic argumentation, again, reported by Seneca. So here are 2 arguments we get for the corporeality of virtue in letter 106. If something alters the form and condition of the body, that thing is corporeal. Virtue alters the form and condition of the body, so virtue is corporeal. Similarly, if something has the power to initiate motion in the body, that thing is corporeal. Virtue has the power to initiate motion in the body, so virtue is corporeal. So here in 8 to 12, the body picks out the human body and its parts, i.e. the material substance of the human animal, which is blended through and through with soul, and which is later separated from the soul at death. So thus, Seneca defends 9 and 12 with the observation that virtue is causally responsible for actions which involve or bring about motions and alterations in the body. For example, courage, one of the virtues, causes Socrates to charge up the hill, an action which brings about motions and alterations in his legs, arms, etc. So the body, in the sense of 8 to 12, is plainly corporeal. And so it appears that the general claims 8 and 11 that we just saw rest on a more fundamental account of causation by contact. So something like 13 and 14. If X acts on Y, X and Y are in contact. If X and Y are in contact, X and Y are corporeal. So we can assume that altering the form and condition of the body, as in 8, and initiating motion in it, as in 11, are different ways that virtue acts on the body. So 13 and 14 are well-attested Stoic doctrines. So Ryer, in a recent paper, has cataloged the texts in support. But there are also claims that are fully endorsed by the Stoics' corporealist rivals, the Epicureans, as indeed Seneca himself notes just after presenting the argument from 8 to 10. So this is T1, text 1, from letter 106. Seneca says, "Surely it is not in doubt that that by which something can be touched is a body, for nothing can touch or be touched except a body, as Lucretius says." Lucretius being the author of the Epicurean epic poem on the nature of things. But all those things which I have mentioned, namely the virtues, would not alter the body unless they touched it, therefore they are bodies. So it looks like virtue, in altering the form and condition of the body and initiating motion in it, acts on the body. But this is possible only if virtue is in contact with the body, which in turn requires that both virtue and the body are corporeal. So similar reasoning leads the Stoics to accept that causes and souls are corporeal. I think we've talked about this quite a bit in the last few days, but it's worth reviewing it. So all causes act, and everything that acts does so through contact. We also get the report that the Stoics hold that all causes are corporeal since they are pneumata, they're portions of breath. In an argument of Chrysippus, the principle seems to be that if X and Y are separated, then X and Y were previously in contact. The body and soul are separated at death, so given that separation implies prior contact and contact implies corporality, i.e. 14, body and soul are corporeal. Qualities, too. Now, so we've just talked about why causes and souls are corporeal, given this basic scheme. Qualities, too, are corporeal, insofar as they are causes. So by qualities, I mean what the Stoics call poiotetes, technically speaking. And here I'm going to be a bit dogmatic. I'm relying mostly on Men's paper, but happy to field questions if you think that this account is somehow flawed. So it seems like, more precisely, the Stoics want to say that the quality F-ness differentiates substance, ousia, with the result that the underlying body, or hypokemenon, which is co-constituted by the quality and substance, is a qualified F thing, a poion. And moreover, they want to say the quality F-ness causes itself to be F. So a standard example is prudence as a quality. Prudence is a quality differentiating the substance of Socrates so that Socrates is a qualified prudent thing. And we also learn that prudence is itself prudent. Tein phronesin phronein. Phronesis itself engages in phronesis. Another example is soul, which according to Men, we should understand as livingness. Soul, livingness is a quality differentiating the substance of Socrates so that Socrates is a qualified alive thing. Soul is also itself alive. So they want to say that the soul is an animal, for it lives. Further examples that we get, hardness is a quality of iron, density a quality of stone, whiteness a quality of silver. That's from a Chrysippus passage in Plutarch. Sweetness and fragrance are qualities of the apple. Knowledge of grammar is a quality of the grammatikos. Gluttony and love of wine are qualities of the glutton and wine lover, respectively. So, for present purposes, what's interesting about this sort of quick, broad-brushed summary of the main contours of Stoic corporealism, it's interesting that both soul and virtue, for example, prudence, are included among the corporeal qualities and causes. Those are sort of treated as non-controversial examples within the Stoa of corporeal qualities and causes. But how exactly should we understand the relationship between Socrates' soul, Socrates' virtue, and Socrates' body? So it seems like, as we'll see in a moment, that the relationship is not straightforward. Clarifying this relationship will shed more light on the contours of Stoic corporealism and allow us to approach the question of the perceptibility of virtue, which is where we're ultimately trying to go. Okay, so now I'm in section 3, where I'm going to try and dig a bit deeper into this relationship between soul, virtue, and body. So, recall that according to Seneca, 9 and 12 are true because Socrates' virtue causes him to perform virtuous actions, and these in turn involve or bring about alteration and motion in his body. Moreover, as we just saw, Socrates' soul is a cause of his being alive, and being alive surely involves alterations and motions in his body. But if Socrates' virtue and Socrates' soul are each causes of Socrates' body engaging in motion and undergoing alteration, it seems like we can have two worries about this sort of picture. So the first worry is causal overdetermination. Is it the soul or is it the virtue which is causing Socrates' body to undergo these changes? it seems like that's maybe one too many causes. Moreover, it seems like if both the soul and the virtue are corporeal entities, it seems like, again, we have a proliferation of entities where we might just want to cut them down to a bit more simpler picture. It seems like we have the Occam's razor type of worry. And these issues, I think, these worries rather, are presented in another passage of Seneca, which I'm going to focus on for a bit, T2 on your handout. So it looks like ultimately my purpose in talking about this passage at length is to clarify this relationship between soul, virtue, and body, but also get a sense of maybe why, given the views we presented earlier in section 2, there's a sort of instability or a problematic feature of this type of account. So now focusing on T2, this is from Seneca letter 113. Seneca says, the context of this letter, 113, the topic is Seneca has been asked to explain the Stoic doctrine that virtues are animals. And we'll get a sense of what that doctrine is and how it relates to these questions in a moment. So here's text 2. It is agreed that the mind is an animal, since the mind itself makes us animals, and since they have derived the term animal from it. Virtue, however, is nothing but the mind in a certain condition, therefore it is an animal. Next, virtue does something, but nothing can be done without an impulse, and only animals have impulse. So if it has impulse, it is an animal. He objects, if virtue is an animal, then virtue itself has virtue. Why shouldn't it have itself? Just as the wise person does everything through his virtue, so virtue does everything through itself. So, he says, all the skills are animals too, and all the things we think about and grasp with the mind. It follows that many thousands of animals dwell within this narrow breast, and that each of us is or has many animals. So, in T2, the idea is that Seneca is sort of approaching the Stoic doctrine that virtue is an animal. The virtues that we have are animals. Animalia, zoa. And he starts in section A of T2 with the apparently more intuitive claim that the mind, i.e. the ruling part of the rational soul, is an animal. So what's this doctrine? We can understand it in the context of the passage considered above, which says that the soul is itself alive and causes the animal of which it is a part to be alive. So given that the mind is a part of the soul, there seems to be a connection between the claim that the mind is an animal and that the soul is itself alive and causes the animal of which it is a part to be alive. So it seems like the idea in T2A is that if we want to know what causes the human animal to live the kind of life it does, what it is that animates the human animal and moves us to act in the ways we naturally do, we should appeal to the mind rather than the non-ruling parts of the soul that are subordinate to the mind. So recall that on the Stoic view, the human soul has 8 parts with distinct spatial locations, 1 mind or ruling part, which is in the chest, from which are spread out 5 perceptual parts, 1 voicing part, and 1 reproductive part. So the life we humans have and the actions we perform are caused, strictly speaking, by the ruling part of the soul, not the other 7 parts. This is because it is the mind or ruling part which is causally responsible for giving assent and generating the impulses in which human actions consist. So that's my attempt at trying to understand the idea in T2A. And a further text, T3, confirms that Seneca's procedure here has a precedent in earlier Greek Stoicism. So this is T3. I've already quoted a bit of it earlier. The Stoics also want to claim that the soul in us is an animal, since it lives and has sense perception, and especially so the ruling part of it, which is called mind. That is why every virtue too is an animal, since it is the same in substance as the mind, accordingly, they say also that prudence is prudent. So it looks like in T3 and in T2a, we get the claim that it's not just the soul that is an animal, but specifically and especially the ruling part, or the mind, that is an animal. And that's because it's the mind which is causally responsible for the sort of life that we have as rational creatures. And moreover, T2 and T3 converge in their account of the relationship between virtue and the mind. And here we're starting to approach the question of what's the relationship between virtue and the soul? What's the relationship between virtue and the mind? To say that virtue and the mind are the same in substance, as we get in T3, implies, I think, that virtue is the mind in a certain condition. So that that virtue is the mind posekon, or in Seneca's Latin, quodam modo se habens, and not that virtue is a quality of the mind. So here we're starting to talk about the categories. So it seems like the Stoic account is that virtue just is the mind somehow disposed, the mind in a certain condition. It's not a quality of the mind. So to see why, let's consider the relationship between the fist and the hand, which is this one standard Stoic example of they'll say that the fist is just the hand in a certain condition. This is because there is no distinct body fistness present in the hand that causes it to be a fist. Rather, the fist is the hand when the hand assumes a certain condition or disposition or arrangement of its parts, which the hand sometimes has and sometimes lacks. Thus, the fist and the hand do not differ in substance, right? There's the same thing in substance there, it's just disposed or in a different condition. That's why I think we can assume, or we can take it that if A is F posejon, F and A do not differ in substance. So, if virtue were a quality of the mind, in the technical Stoic sense, virtue and the mind would differ in substance, and this is the claim that's denied in T3. And another text says that virtues are the same kath hypostasin as the ruling part of the soul. So, we get elsewhere a confirmation of the claim that virtue is the ruling part in a certain condition. It's not just in T2 and T3. But is that claim compatible with other Stoic sources which categorize virtue, namely prudence, as a quality? Wasn't that one of our examples of quality before? This seems like it's a point of tension. Here I'm going to take the solution which Stephen Menn has proposed. Yes, these claims are compatible if we properly specify what virtue is a quality of. Virtue, being the mind in a certain condition, is a quality of the human animal, or of the underlying body human, one of whose parts is the mind and the other is the body. Thus, virtue differs in substance from the human animal, since the substance of virtue is simply pneuma, since it's the same in substance as the mind, whereas the substance of the human animal includes both pneuma and the passive elements blended together. This might have not always been Chrysippus' position. Stephen Menn argues that Chrysippus himself might have undergone a change on this point, but it's definitely his considered mature position, that virtue is the mind in a certain condition and not a quality of the mind. So furthermore, T2a and T3 both claim that the animality of virtue follows from the animality of the mind, given that virtue is the mind in a certain condition and virtue and the mind do not differ in substance. My suggestion is that maybe this inference that we find in both texts is motivated by a more general principle, 15. If X is Y in a certain condition, then X and Y do not differ in their causal profile. So here, causal profile refers to the activities that X and Y causally bring about and the affections that X and Y take on, i.e., the active and passive causal relations they enter into. Since animality is defined in causal terms, X is an animal if X causes itself and some underlying body F to be alive, right? That's what we got in those other texts. From 15, it follows that since the mind is an animal, so too is virtue. If the mind causes us to be an animal, and the mind and virtue are the same in substance, then virtue should also cause us to be animal, but that's just what it is to be an animal. This principle could also underwrite the inference in T2b. Given 15 and the claim that the mind is causally responsible for impulse, it follows that virtue is also causally responsible for impulse. And so, since animals are distinguished from plants and inanimate objects by forming impulse, virtue is an animal. Then in T2c, we finally move to those objections. Seneca considers here the objection that, you'll recall, if virtue is an animal, then virtue itself has virtue. That's the objection that Seneca poses against this position. Although not fully clear, the problem here appears to be that the Stoic view generates an implausible proliferation of entities. The objector in T2c seems to be operating with a common sense metaphysics of virtue, on which the virtue of something is one of many qualities that underlying substance can have, and no virtue can have itself. Maybe because no virtue needs to have itself, since it's already perfect or self-sufficient. And also, if virtue is a quality, no quality hosts another quality. This is maybe the common sense metaphysics of virtue that the objector is operating with. So while it's fine to say that an animal can have virtue, it's nonsensical to say that a virtue can have itself. But Stoic theory in making virtue an animal would seem to populate the world with virtues of virtues, creating an implausible proliferation of entities. Seneca's reply on behalf of Orthodox Stoicism rejects this common sense metaphysics of virtue. Virtue has itself not because it isn't already perfect or self-sufficient, and not because another quality is being hosted in it, but rather because it causes itself to be virtuous. And this kind of self-causation is found in all Stoic qualities, Fnesses that cause themselves and the underlying body of which they are a part to be a qualified F thing. Okay. Moreover, with the aid of 15, we can understand the connection Seneca draws in T2c between the wise man doing everything through virtue and virtue doing everything through itself. The wise man does everything through virtue in the sense that everything the wise man does is a causal effect of his mind, and virtue just is the mind in a certain condition. Here we should recall the account developed in Stoic logic of knowledge as a set of inseparable bodies of knowledge, sciences, whose theorems extend beyond the narrowly moral and bear on any possible practical decision and intellectual judgment the sage could make. Thus, everything the sage does is done on the basis of all the virtues, our source says, for all of his actions are perfect, being bereft of none of the virtues. So the Stoic conception of virtue as an inseparable body, a set of inseparable bodies of knowledge, whose theorems comprehend all aspects of life, leads us to the next objection, the last one I'll talk about in T2d, which also is paralleled in a Plutarch passage that I've noted there. For if it is knowledge that causes the sage to act whenever he does, then since animality is defined in causal terms, every piece of the sage's knowledge should count as an animal, which is what the objector seems to say. All the skills are animals too, and all the things we think about and grasp with the mind. So you're thinking of virtue as a sort of skill, as a sort of techne, and all the things we think about and grasp with the mind, all the individual assents which constitute that body of knowledge should also count as animals. So I think this objection brings out most clearly the twin worries of causal overdetermination, because the same virtuous action is apparently caused by the mind, virtue, and all the pieces of knowledge which make up virtue. And it raises the issue of the overproliferation of bodies. For if each piece of knowledge is an animal, then it follows that many thousands of animals dwell within this narrow breast, and that each of us is or has many animals. Seneca responds to this. So finally we get the response. This is T4. Seneca says, individual animals should have individual substances. All of them have one mind, and so they can be individuals, but they cannot be many individuals. I am both an animal and a man, but for all that, you will not say that we are two. Why is that? because we would have to be separated from each other. My claim is this: in order to be two, one thing must be distanced from the other. Whatever is multiple within a single object falls under one nature, and so is one. So the idea here is that virtue, knowledge, and the mind don't count as distinct animals or distinct individuals because they have a single substance and are unified by the same nature, the natura that Seneca mentions, i.e., the same state or hexis of pneuma. So it seems like even though we could call, so even though virtue, the mind, knowledge have the same causal profile, even though virtue, mind, and knowledge are same in substance, it doesn't follow that they're distinct animals because they are unified in a certain way. And that seems to be the official answer to the proliferation worry. And the causal overdetermination worry also seems to get an answer, for in saying that virtue, knowledge, and the mind are each causes of virtuous action, the Stoics are not picking out distinct corporeal causes, but just describing them in different ways. Okay, so I hope that clarifies the relationship between the mind, virtue, and the body. Now moving on to section 4. Finally, we're getting into the perceptibility of virtue. So to recapitulate, we can understand the metaphysics of unified objects as follows. So we have 3 types of underlying body there. So the silver ring is pneuma in the condition of state and substance, the quality of whiteness. Apple is pneuma in the condition of nature and substance, qualities being sweetness and fragrance. And Socrates, pneuma in the condition of soul and substance, and his qualities are prudence and courage, let's assume. So recall that the pneuma co-constituting the underlying body is the quality Fness and causes itself in the underlying body to be F. And moreover, the different conditions of pneuma, state, nature, and soul, are analyzed as different tensions or tensional movements in the pneuma. So pneuma, right, we've heard a lot about this, is a mixture of fire and air. It has simultaneous inward and outward movements, and the different conditions of those movements account for different states of the pneuma. So in the case of the ring and the apple, it's obvious that we can perceive the qualities of the underlying body. No one would deny that you can't smell the fragrance of an apple. No one would deny that you can't perceive the whiteness of a silver ring. According to the Stoics, this is because the underlying body imprints the mind through perception, either by direct contact or the medium of air. The external body affects and alters the perceptual soul parts, which in turn transmit these alterations to the ruling part or mind, where a perceptual impression is formed. The mind uses its store of concepts to process and articulate the alterations received from the perceptual soul parts, so that the perceptual impression it forms is a thought with propositional content. Notice that on this story, the external object causally affects the perceiver's perceptual soul parts. We can assume that it is the pneuma in the object that is responsible for this causal activity, as opposed to its substance. It's not the earth and water which are responsible for the underlying body causally affecting our perceptual soul parts. It's the pneuma, the qualities. But the Stoics don't want to say that in a perceptual encounter with a ring, it's merely pneuma and not the substance blended together with it that is perceived. This is because it is true on their view to say that the composite underlying body, of which the quality Fness is a part, is itself F. So if one forms the true perceptual impression that the ring is white, it does not follow that one is thinking solely about the ring's pneuma on its own. This thought says something true about the composite underlying body, the ring, of which pneuma is one part. So, in principle, this is the big climax of after all this legwork. In principle, the Stoics can tell the same story about Socrates and his qualities. So, suppose that Alcibiades encounters Socrates. Being corporeal, Socrates affects and alters the perceptual soul parts of Alcibiades, which in turn transmit these alterations to Alcibiades' mind. Alcibiades' mind uses its store of concepts to process and articulate the alterations received from the perceptual soul parts, so that it forms the perceptual impression that Socrates is courageous. This perceptual impression is not about Socrates' body in isolation, and it's not about Socrates' soul in isolation. It's not just about the pneuma, and it's not just about the ousia. Rather, this impression says something true about the composite underlying body, Socrates, even though it is one part of Socrates, his virtue, i.e. the pneuma in a certain condition, that is causally responsible for Socrates being virtuous and for Alcibiades' perceptual soul parts being changed. Hence, I think, Chrysippus sees no difficulty in the claim that virtue is perceptible. So this is the big text where he says this, T6. And Chrysippus says that goods and bads are perceptible, writing the following in Book 1 of On Goals. For even with the following, one has enough to assert that goods and bads are perceptible, for not only are the passions perceptible, including their species, for example, grief and fear, and so on, but also it is possible to perceive theft and adultery and similar things, and in general, thoughtlessness and cowardice and not a few other vices, and not only joy in correct actions and many other virtuous actions, but also prudence and courage and the rest of the virtues. Elsewhere, the Stoics divide what is good between virtues and virtuous actions, and analogously what is bad between vices and vicious actions. So, what's going on in T6? It doesn't provide an argument, but it instead asserts that both types of bad are perceptible, vicious actions as well as vices are perceptible, and it also asserts that both types of good are perceptible, not only virtuous actions, but also the virtues themselves. One might suppose that Chrysippus is trying to infer from the clearer or simpler or easier case of the perceptibility of virtuous and vicious actions, that virtues and vices are perceptible too, right? That would be like the intuitive thought. It's like, well, if we can perceive virtuous actions, then maybe that's going to lead us to an argument for perceiving virtues themselves. But that doesn't seem to be what's going on in T6. It's just an assertion. The perceptibility of dispositions, virtue and vice, and the actions is here set on a par. So we can understand this feature of T6 if we pull together our discussion in section 2 and the Stoic theory of perception presented above. And I think this is sort of the argument that they're relying on. So the mind is pneuma. Pneuma causes changes in the perceptual soul parts of human perceivers. Both virtue and vice are the mind in a certain condition. And then we have our old principle. If X is Y in a certain condition, then X and Y do not differ in their causal profile. Virtue and vice cause changes in the perceptual soul parts of human perceivers, so virtue and vice are perceptible. That, I think, is the argument that we find, or that could be given. And the reasoning supporting the perceptibility of virtuous and vicious actions is structurally similar. So, according to one text, virtuous actions participate in virtue and are described as supervenient effects epigenemata of virtue. Recall also that Chrysippus famously analyzes the action of walking as the ruling part itself. These remarks suggest that for the Stoics, virtuous action just is the mind in a certain condition if we take condition in a loose sense that embraces not only its permanent and impermanent dispositions, but also its patterns of activity. So 16 through 20 gave us the argument for virtue and vice being perceptible. It seems like we could just make a slight modification to 18 and 19 to get the same result. So both virtuous and vicious actions are the mind in a certain condition, and virtuous and vicious actions cause changes in the perceptual soul parts of human perceivers. So if we could find further cases beyond virtue, vice, and virtuous and vicious actions in which the Stoics claim that conditions of the mind are perceptible, the present interpretation would be on stronger footing. Because it seems to be the crucial move seems to be that the argument in 16 through 20 right there. And in fact, this is what we find. So in T7, we get the idea that I'll just read it out. All the human senses far surpass those of animals, for in the first place they discern with subtlety many things in the realm of expertise for which the eyes are the judge, like painting, modeling, and sculpture. And also in bodily motion and gesture, for there the eyes judge elegance of form and shape, as well as orderliness, and so to speak propriety. Not to mention even greater things, for they grasp virtues and vices, and someone who is angry or friendly, joyful or sad, brave or a coward, bold or timid. So elsewhere, the Stoics distinguish different types of psychological condition. Those that admit of increase and decrease, scalar conditions, such as psychological disease, and those that do not, non-scalar dispositions, such as virtue and vice. So it's famously a Stoic doctrine that you can't be more or less virtuous or more or less vicious. Those don't come in degree, but you can be more or less of a money lover or more or less of a glutton. So some psychological conditions admit of increase or decrease, psychological diseases being among them, but not virtue and vice. Those are binary or non-scalar dispositions, as Graeber calls them. So I'm reading T7 as saying that certain scalar conditions, for example, irascibility or friendliness, are perceptible, as well as the non-scalar conditions, virtue and vice. And that's, again, what we'd expect, because all of these conditions are simply the mind, the pneuma, in a certain condition. And then we have a very interesting text, T8. It is said that some young men set out to play a trick on Cleanthes, who followed Zeno in claiming that character can be grasped from form. They brought to him a man who was sexually deviant, but toughened up through his work in the fields, and they demanded that Cleanthes should declare his character. He could not make it out, and he told the man to go away, but as the man was going, he sneezed, and Cleanthes said, "I have him, he's dissolute." There I'm using George Boystone's translation. So I think we can understand the agrarian's malakia, dissolution, in T8 as a scalar condition of soul, sort of erotic psychological disease, if you like. Since T8 claims that this condition is perceptible, the account here is consistent with T7. Both texts then point to a further refinement of 18 and 19, which I've given you there. We should also note the general claim attributed to Zeno in T8 that character can be grasped from form. Atalepton enaito ethos ex edus. Zeno elsewhere defines character as the spring of life from which particular actions flow. And so I think we can assume that it refers to the mind in a certain condition. Any sort of aspect of character can be perceived because it's just the mind in a certain condition. I can say a bit more about what form means in the claim that character can be grasped from form. I worked a bit on that in the Stoic Eros material I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, but I'm going to move on here. Admittedly, though, I have to admit, we don't have evidence that the Stoics declare that knowledge or individual theoretical assents are perceptible, even though these things too are simply the mind in a certain condition. But focusing only on virtue, vice, and the scalar psychological conditions mentioned in T7 and T8, a lingering worry remains. If these states are perceptible, then why did the Athenians execute Socrates? Couldn't they have just perceived that Socrates had the virtues, and why would they want to kill him if virtue is perceptible? They should have just given him the banquets as he requested in apology. So I think the Stoic reply is that while virtue, vice, etc., are perceptible given their ontological status, it does not follow that just any human perceiver will in fact perceive them. This is because the perceiver's mind is an indispensable part of the process by which perceptual impressions are formed. So if the perceiver's mind is not furnished with the concepts that allow them to identify the presence of F-ness in some external object A, they will not form the perceptual impression that A is F. And in my book on Stoic Eros, I propose that what the Stoics call erotike techne is just this general expertise of character, this general expertise of discerning character. One final text I think is important in this connection is Heracles, who confirms that expertise is sometimes required to perceive character traits. So T9 from Heracles. In this way, indeed, I fully expect that someone who is good at judging characters, if he stands next to people in their sleep, will be able to recognize on the basis of his manner of sleeping what kind of disposition the sleeper has, whether it is strong and full of tension, tonos, or else more dissolute than it should be. So recall that dissolution is the vicious character trait perceptually detected by Cleanthes in T8. T9 underscores that scalar psychological conditions manifest even in sleep. The causal activity of the corporeal mind is constant and never fully latent in regulating the motion of the body. However, only someone good at judging characters, that is in possession of the relevant expertise, is able to form an impression that discloses these psychological causes. Okay, so that's all I wanted to say about the perceptibility of virtue, and I'm sure there's lots of questions, and I can go into them in detail. Again, I tried to, as I said at the beginning, I was trying to just focus on, as much as I could, on the sort of doctrines of Stoic physics that lead to that conclusion. But in conclusion, my final section, the last point I want to make, is to raise the question I mentioned in the introduction regarding the connection, if any, between the corporeality and perceptibility of virtue on the one hand, and the Stoic commitment to moral realism and the possibility of objective moral judgment on the other. So, as I mentioned, this suggestion was first briefly made in Long and Sedley. They write, obvious cognitive problems arise about the foundations of objective moral judgment if the corporeality and perceptibility of virtue are denied. So I think in one sense, the corporeality of virtue is clearly relevant to the Stoic defense of moral realism. Or the corporeality of virtue tells us in what sense virtue and the good are real. They're bodies, and thus they're equally real as any object studied by the natural sciences and existing in the Stoic cosmos. The corporality of virtue helps us to specify how the Stoics could be accurately described as meta-ethical naturalists, i.e., the ways in which, on their view, moral properties are part of the fabric of the natural world. Next, I think, though the corporality of virtue is consistent with the possibility of objective moral judgment, I don't think it's required for it. This is because there could be objective moral judgments about virtue and the good, even if virtue and the good were incorporeal in the manner of propositions and arguments in Stoic logic. The Stoics think one can be objectively right or wrong in one's judgments about, e.g., whether this proposition follows from these or whether this argument is sound. And the same could be true on the assumption that virtue and the good were not bodies, but sayables of some kind. So you don't need corporeality for objectivity. You could have objective judgments about incorporeals. Moreover, the Stoics themselves do not appeal to the perceptibility of virtue to establish its manner of existence. So you might think, you could imagine a purely empiricist story where they could say, why is virtue real? Why is it a body? Because I perceived it, just as I perceived that this is white or the apple is sweet. But they don't use that sort of strategy. It's not sort of a brute empiricist argument. Rather, the manner in which virtue and the good exist is demonstrated by arguments of the kind I presented in sections 1 and 2, sort of a priori reasoning, if you like. Nor is the perceptibility of virtue used to explain how we acquire the concept of the good. Given the rarity of actually good things, i.e. virtuous sages, who are rarer than the phoenix, we could not acquire our concept of the good through direct confrontation. So, while there's an abundance of white things out in the world, we can form our concept of white by regularly encountering white things. Because the sage is so rare, we couldn't form our concept of the good by regularly encountering good things. Instead, we form our concept of the good by analogy from the things which are according to nature. So, I conclude, the perceptibility of virtue and the good is recognized as a consequence of their ontological status, but this thesis is not used as a premise or motivation for their metaethical views in the way that Long and Sedley pose. Thank you.
Any questions? Ricardo?
Questions. What have to do with this concept of being the same in substance? So the example, well, the standard example, as you say, is the hand and the fist. They are the same in substance, in the sense that the fist is just the hand somehow exposed.
Right.
It's not. I mean, a hand doesn't become a fist when something other than the hand adheres to the hand. But just when the hand itself is exposed in a certain way. That's the idea, right? So, but this expression, being the same in substance, when you just report this text, it read, is Studios. Well, the thing is that being the same substance can be read in another way. You know, I mean, two things can be the same substance in the sense that they adhere to the substance. So, virtue and the mind could be said the same substance in the sense that they are both in a certain they have a concept. But this wouldn't imply that the mind and virtue are either distinct or not distinct. No? I mean, it's not. I mean, what I want to say is that the text doesn't say that virtue is just the mind plus no, and but although that's the idea, no. But I mean, there is nothing in the text in itself that says that this is the. No, it's an interpretation. How do you read it? Or is there any instance of the use of the term being the same in substance, where it becomes clear that this is a technical term that is used to mean that something is nothing but another thing? That's one word.
Okay. Yeah.
Just that.
Yeah, thanks. I'm not sure. I haven't dug into whether being the same in substance is regularly used as a technical term. I'd have to look that up. I guess to answer your question, yeah, it was merely an interpretation on my part because, yeah, so in T2, he says pretty clearly that virtue is the mind, posekon, or the Latin version of that. And in T3, they say that virtue and the mind are the same in substance. And we have one more passage where he says they're the same kath hupostasin, which maybe to me suggests that there isn't sort of a terminological uniformity. And I think they're just maybe different. I could be wrong, but my sense is that they're just maybe different ways of expressing the same thought. That was my interpretation.
And this connects with my other question, which is the question of the possibility of virtue, main topic. I think that the passages that you quote as evidence in T8 and T9, what they show is the stronger thesis that virtue is not just perceptible but obvious. So that even inversely, the sage or some expert can I mean, an expert can tell whether someone is or isn't a virtuous person by merely standing next to a person in the state, right? I mean, so this means that virtue is obvious, not perceptible, because being perceptible can be something that, well, it's perceptible, but it is very difficult to grasp. So So what you want to prove is the weaker thesis. I mean, just the weaker thesis, or also the thesis for which TA39 are evidence, namely that virtue is a kind of body or corporeal state that is obvious to.
Yeah, that's good. That's interesting. Thank you for that. Yeah, I guess I'm focusing on the modal perceptible claim because I think T6 is like the most authoritative, right? Because it looks like it's a verbatim quotation from Chrysippus, and that's how he puts the point. T8 is kind of interesting, right? Because there's a sort of difficulty that Cleanthes has. So with only one set of information, he fails to perceive the character of the agrarian. And it's only when the agrarian sneezes that he perceives the relevant character trait. And this is something that George Boy Stones emphasizes, which I think is right, is that this makes the Stoic theory very unlike what in antiquity was called physiognomy. So physiognomy was, measuring the static shape of your body. You could figure out someone's character. That's not really the Stoic theory. They're not talking about the body, the static shape of the body. They're talking about the soul-body blend and how that composite is changed and moved. And so it looks like Cleanthes, maybe, I don't know what to say. Is he an expert? Well, maybe not. Maybe because he needed that additional piece of information, he's not. Or maybe, but I think the idea there is, I think the Stoic view would be even weirder than it already is if they thought everyone automatically and easily perceived character in the way that we automatically and easily perceive whiteness. And I think their principled answer to that is that's because we all have the preconception white. The concept white is part of our natural rational machinery that we all form without any effort. But it takes it's very difficult to have the sort of conceptual sophistication that would get you to distinguish character traits. And that's what I say in the book Stoic Eros. I say that is the function of the erotike techne, that's the relevant body of knowledge that gives you that. But I guess I'm saying I think that it has to be a sort of question of expertise. Given that they wrote books called Erotic Expertise, and in T9 it seems pretty clear that it's only T9 seems to indicate that it's an extraordinary achievement of experts that they perceive character.
So I have Roger, Manuel, and Anna. Does anyone else want a question? Mary? Alex? Okay, right. Okay.
Thank you. I want to ask about your principle 15.
Yeah.
I'm a little worried.
Yeah.
Because it seems to license the conclusion that courage causes the animal to be alive.
Mm-hmm.
And that sounds like it wrecks the distinction between courage as a quality and other things. In particular, the causal profile that is supposed to be assigned to the mind, insofar as it's in an animality.
So you're thinking, okay, so courage is the mind in a certain condition. The mind causes the animal to be alive.
Courage doesn't do that, except if we bracket it, except if we try to talk about courage only using courage as a term to refer to the mind. I mean,
well, what do you think about the claim that every virtue is an animal?
I mean, I have a different story about why this inference works.
Okay.
But I mean, forgetting about that, it just looks like this principle is a little worrisome, because I would be inclined to think that courage is a specific type of cause with a certain profile, and it seems the wrong result to assign to it the role of causing the animal to be alive, which isn't the job of courage. It doesn't do it. I mean, it specifically doesn't do it.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would dispute that different virtues have different causal profiles. I mean, they say that all virtues have the same telos, and they have the same effect, which is that they make us happy. But I see your point. I think I also was a bit worried about 15, and I thought of a few counterexamples myself. So if you think that So, maybe you could say, this causes me to think this is a fist and this doesn't. But the fist and the hand are the same in substance. And so is that a counterexample? I think maybe I have to weaken 15 a bit, but I was just that was my attempt at making sense of the inference. I guess, though, I'm not too uncomfortable with the consequence, though, that a single virtue, is an animal in the sense that it causes us to be alive. I think given T2 and T3, I don't see that as that far off from what they're trying to say there.
But wait, doesn't that get the causal relations wrong? I mean, it's fine that courage is an animal, but it isn't an animal insofar as it causes us to be alive. It's an animal insofar as it is alive. And how do you tell that it is alive? Because it is the mind plus economic. And the mind is alive. I mean, that seems to be the argument.
Yeah, I guess I thought that animality, being an animal, was sort of not just having the property being alive, but also causing something else to be alive.
I mean, set something off. But I think the reason this works is that the mind is also the quality of animality. But this isn't true of all animals. Like the mind is an animal, and also the quality, and it causes itself to be alive. But the composite animal doesn't cause itself to be alive. It's one con that does that.
I see.
See what I mean?
Yeah, I see what you're saying. I have to think about that. I need to think more about that. I think that's I think 15 is in trouble anyway, but I appreciate that. Thank you. I'll think more about that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for your presentation. And my question is something like the question about qualities and causes, because I wonder myself how make compatible these claims, this thesis about qualities and causes are animals or are bodies with the Stoic theory or the Stoic definition about a body as what do you say, 3 dimensions. And because it seems that the body and this ancient, this old definition has error his own life and not living in the soul. Because I wonder, virtue in this context is it's defined as a body, but it seems that it's in a body with the first definition, but just living in another one. Yeah, and the same with the definition of cause, because, for example, I was thinking about lecta, because Alecta, it would be a cause, but it's incorporeal. So how can to be compatible these two conceptions of body?
Yeah, well, I think if you just take body as 3-dimensional extended thing with resistance, virtue meets that because it's spatially located right here in your mind. And it's a certain condition of the pneuma that is your mind. So it is a body. It's a fiery, airy mixture in your chest.
Yes, but I was thinking about, for example, virtue. And it doesn't seem that virtues living for itself, but in the soul. And so I think that, it's a quality or a disposition of thought, but it seems that can be lived or become. So Yes, that's my question, and also about lecta.
Yeah. Well, I think maybe that's the sort of, maybe you have some, what I was calling the common sense metaphysics of virtue, where you have, an underlying substance and then it hosts virtue. I think the Stoics want to say that's not the right relationship when you think about the way virtue is related to the mind. It's not that the mind is hosting a sort of distinct quality. It's just virtue is just the mind in a certain disposition. There's not something else there that is the virtue. It's just the mind being arranged in a certain way. And yeah, I think causes and lecta, you don't want to say that incorporeals are causes, because then they would act and be bodies. So you can't say that.
Yes, but lecta, if you say something and you say you order something to someone, for example, it could be a cause for an action, but it's incorporeal.
Well, you got to distinguish between the sound and the lecta. And you also got to distinguish between the mind's impression in hearing the sound and the impression's content, which is incorporeal.
Thank you.
Thank you. So for the Stoics, actionist is F. Is that right? Because actionist causes itself to be F. How? A bit more.
Yes, good question. Well, I think the idea is, so the qualities are going to be stretches of pneuma, and they are going to be moving simultaneously inward and outward. And the idea would be what prudence is. For example, we learn right there, right? I'm just trying to render this idea in T3, that tein phronesis phronein, which looks like we have a sort of self-predication, a sort of self-causation. And so on Stephen Menn's story, which I was sort of dogmatically assuming, his account of the categories is that the Stoics start off with the sort of Platonic intuition that F-ness is itself F, and that's why it causes the thing that hosts it to be F. So they start with a sort of academic Platonic intuition that qualities self-predicate. And then on Menn's story, they discover that certain predicates, certain attributions, certain features of underlying bodies cannot be explained in this way. For example, sitting. So there's no sittingness that causes me to be sitting. I am sitting because my underlying body is in a certain condition. And so this is the Stephen Menn story, is that wherever possible, they want they'll say that the attribute F is caused by the presence of some corporeal F-ness that is itself F, but they realize that model doesn't really work across the board. And that's what motivates Chrysippus to fill out the 4 categories. But I think you were asking about I'm not an expert on Stoic qualities. Again, I was kind of maybe dogmatically assuming that, but does that help answer your question? Okay.
Is to say red. So you can say redness, reddens. Redness is red.
Yeah.
Or redness causes itself to be red, which is what you, I think, propose as a translational interpretation of the text. But I see, while I can see how redness reddens, how redness is red, the one I cannot see is the redness causes itself to be red, especially on a Stoic theory of causation, but I think any theory of causation, unless you go for a part of an agent causes another part of itself to be in a certain way. So I can't see it under influence, can't see it under what I call neurological, I just can't see it. So for the other two as other possible readings of the text that would make more sense what the Stoics want to say, and then I wonder if any of the two appeals to you.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, you're right that the text is just saying F-ness F's, And that could be,
that being hot is hot, you know. I mean, or you could take I think you could example with heat and hot, but you can think that is we could think dispositionally. So a certain disposition exercises itself, manifests itself. So brightness. But it's also, I mean, that's the most plausible, I think, literal understanding of the text, and I think it makes sense. But otherwise, you can say redness is red, that's Platonic self-predication.
Yeah, I think, there's been a lot written on qualities lately. And I think one of the texts that I mentioned, there's sort of a division of labor, and it's somehow, so the fire and the air, which make up pneuma, have different jobs. I think Bryan alluded to this text. There's another one where I think it's the air, in this first one, the Chrysippus and Plutarch, it's the air specifically that is the hardness, the density, and the whiteness, if I've got it right. And maybe the idea is that it somehow like constrains or sort of sets the sort of determines the boundaries under which the substance behaves in a certain way. But again, like I think I need to think more about that, and I shouldn't just say it causes itself to be. I think there might be a further ways to understand that. So thanks for that.
A super quick note on that, and just say that there are other texts that make that causal claim explicitly.
Then it's more burden, though, makes sense with, right?
Yeah,
if there is no way out from the text, then it makes sense.
So the color examples are, some sort needs to be told about that.
Yeah.
But there is, in fact, very good reason to think that, I completely agree with Simon, and in fact that it's somehow generally true that not only is the Fness F, it also calls itself to be F. And by being F, it is able to be the Fness.
Suppose I take that, as what Stoics hold, but then the question, philosophically speaking, remains: how's that done?
It's true.
Yeah. So when I say then the Stoics are left without an explanation of what they're saying, which may be the case historically, but that doesn't take away the burden of mask trying to make sense of it, especially if it's an account of sort of, the causes is present in the effect, so the thing is present in itself. So what does that mean?
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I wanted to ask you about virtuous action. And I think maybe I just missed something or I'm being a bit obtuse, but I didn't quite see how you have this on page 8, you have these remarks suggest that for the Stoic virtuous action just is the mind in the settling condition.
Yeah.
I didn't see how you got there.
Yes. Well, that's a good question. So I was thinking, we get this claim in the same letter as T2, I believe. Yeah, letter 113. There we get Chrysippus saying, what is walking? It's just the ruling part. And so generalizing, it seems like any action just is the ruling part. And maybe that's because, well, what are actions? They're impulses. And what generates impulse? An act of assent. What does that? The ruling part. And so you might think that's the sort of rough story about how actions are just the ruling part. So if you want to know what an action is, you sort of go to the causal basis for that, and that's the mind. And so the fact that the mind assented to it's appropriate for me to walk on this occasion is just a reflection of sort of a temporary moment of activity that it underwent. That's the best I can do.
Maybe part of what I'm struggling with what counts as an action.
Yeah.
So I guess, how do we individuate actions? It's not obvious to me that walking without any further qualification of what is an action.
Yeah, and also back in T9, like, is snoring an action? Like the way you hold yourself when you're asleep, and the other text that I didn't mention, like it's about the way that you walk, the gait, these sorts of things are relevant to the claim that virtue and other character states are perceptible. And do those count as actions? Like, are you literally how? I think that's a fair question for the Stoic view. But I think their answer has to be ultimately it's the causal foundation is the mind. But how that works out, I agree. And it looks like there's a big difference between walking on the one hand and these sort of like behavioral tics on the other. But they want to say that those are all just caused by the mind. At least that's how I am trying to understand them. But yeah, I think that's a fair question to ask.
Thank you. Thanks very much. It's very interesting. I was basically a series of questions that ask you to, on the sort of subject of, and we understand more about the theory of perception. So I'm just wondering, so if, am I right in so I think one option would, am I right in thinking it's something like the following as a story? So in any episode of perception in which we're proceeding to some object, sort of the first stage in our mind is something like, sort of, about the bare perception or something like this, and something, in effect, we're sort of affected initially by all the qualities of the object. And then what makes the difference between, say, my perception impressions and your perception impressions are what kinds of concepts we have. So that's sort of option one. So we're always, in any episode of perception, we're always affected by all the qualities of the relative object, and then what makes the difference from perception impressions is purely our concepts, our activities.
Right.
And option two would be, it isn't all the qualities that get in there in the first place. There's some more story to be told, say, about situations or modes of perception and so on. So, I mean, if we went with option one, then I suppose we would have to say that, for example, with the appropriate level of expertise, I could tell just by looking whether an apple is sweet. I could tell by smelling whether a stone is dense. I could tell by smelling whether someone is virtuous. Presumably. I mean, these are episodes of perception, and each of them would presumably depend a little bit on quality. But I mean, and the other type of story would be that perhaps there are some other constraints, maybe favored modalities of senses for types of quality, or specific types of activity. I mean, so like the in the story of the dissolute person, maybe you have to sneeze, you know, maybe character traits are especially revealed by or only get transmitted in certain type of situation, if you're acting in certain ways. So what do you think about this? Do we get everything in the first place and it's just concepts that make the difference, or might it be that we get different amounts of things? And if so, why?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. Well, I think I don't think what you called the first picture is right. Because one constraint is the perceptual soul parts, the sort of conduits, as one passage calls it, the tentacles of the octopus, right? So the portions of pneuma that are spread out from your mind, which are connected to your sense organs. Clearly, they're going to be altered by different sorts of things, not in like as Baroque of a way as the Epicureans will do it, but I think something like that has to be right, that like sweetness only causes alterations in certain sorts of parts of the soul. So that'd be one constraint. And so, yeah, so I think, and then, of course, there's going to be differences based on your sort of perceptual conditions, like, how much light there is going to affect how much you can see. That's pretty clearly a Stoic commitment. And I do like the idea that maybe it seems like all of our texts are about the visual perception of character, but we actually have one text which says that the sage has removed any affectation from their voice. So maybe virtue is audible. So you could, I agree. In principle, it shouldn't just be visual. Although it would be weird to have taste and smell and touch. I don't want to go down there.
The whole story.
So, I'm not really sure.
True. But yeah, I think that's a good question. But I think, so I don't think the answer to your question is the first story is not right.
But then what would make the difference between why would some qualities be specific to certain values of perception and others not? And in the sense that you're sort of starting from the point of view of Stoic physics and saying that this just would naturally follow.
Well, we don't have as much information on the sort of mechanics of how qualities come to be registered by the perceptual soul parts in the way that we do for the Epicureans. I think there's one passage, right? I think I referred to it, is that, the light, vision is all about a cone that extends outwards from the eye. But that's very obscure. Does anyone know anyone know how to make sense of that? So I don't think we have like a detailed, please. Okay, I'll take that. But yeah, so I think, yeah, there's not, I mean, I don't know. The answer is we don't have the same sort of detailed story as the Epicureans.
Any more questions?
Well, I can follow up if you're talking about this. For information, I don't know the passage on those professional. So, what is the sneezing? Why is the sneezing sign? We try to connect. It is the fact that it sneezes, so something that it sees, or perhaps how it sneezes, the sound of the sneeze. To come back to the fact that perhaps in this case is something that he hears rather than sees. What was the story behind? Why is it dissoluble? Is this what's the function of that?
That's hard to say. I mean, this is all we have. I would say, yeah, like I think the way that George suggests it, and which I think is right, is that it's the story I mentioned, that it's not pure physiognomy in the sense that it's not merely the static shape, it's action. And going back to Marian's question about like, well, does the sneeze count as an action? I mean, you don't really assent that it's appropriate to sneeze. But somehow...
Okay, so it's not a way of sneezing, like undignified...
maybe, yeah, go on, sorry.
Yeah, I was asking what kind of scenario we have in mind. Why is it because... It's just because you shouldn't sneeze, or does it in a way which is too loud, or...
It's too effeminate.
The guy is dissolute because by sneezing it shows that his pneuma is not well, together by the, it's just kind of loose. So, that's because he sneezes.
The tono, bad tonos.
It's bad tonos. That's why by sneezing it displays that it's dissolute. And that is play on dissolute, like dissolution, less.
What's the word for this?
Yeah.
Malakos.
I think that's why it's fun, exactly, yeah. So don't sneeze.
I just one small.
Yeah, sure.
About text 2, right? And in relation to the idea that prudence costs itself. Right? Because, text 2 says it is agreed that the mind is the mind that makes most animals. So the idea seems to be like an acceptance of the principle of cosmos in the meaning, right? Which comes from Plato or Darwin. It cannot be that the mind makes us animals if it were not an animal. So in order to make it has to be an animal. And then we get the question, why, how is it that, and then something similar would be the case. Prudence, that's prudence makes prudent. It is prudent. So the question is, why is prudence prudent? We are going to give an answer, and you say that the answer is because it makes itself prudent. Right? It's a cost of itself being prudent. And it is either that, or it is the other option is to say that it's primitively prudent. Right? There's no cost. Nothing makes prudence prudent. But the Stoics don't say that.
Yeah, well, I think they want to say that. So they're quite clear that the soul is a quality of the composite person, the composite animal. Why is that? Because it causes the animal to be alive. And then they make the move that, well, is it really the whole soul that does that? No, it's really just one part of it. Well, one part of it, the mind, can be in different conditions. And the idea would be one such condition would be virtue. Virtue is just the mind in a certain condition. It's not a separate thing inhering in the mind. It's just an arrangement of the mind. And then I was saying, this is the sort of discussion about premise 15 that we were talking about.
Yeah.
It seems like, well, since virtue is just the mind in a certain condition, and the mind causes us to be alive, virtue should also cause us to be alive. That's how I was understanding it, and that's what we were disputing a moment ago. And the idea would be, well, how does so they also want to say, right, there's other texts that say that knowledge is also the mind in a certain condition. And so the idea would be, And they also want to say that virtue is knowledge, right? So virtue just is a mastery of certain theorems. So the prudence is mastery of the theorems relating to what should be done and should not be done. That's how they characterize it in one place. And so prudence itself is that's just the mind. It's made up of this, it sort of has this grasp of these theorems related to what should be done. And yeah, so I think that's the sense in which prudence is itself prudent. It sort of is the mind in receipt and sort of theorizing about these matters. That's kind of the rough story I was trying to put forward, but I think I might have to tinker with it to avoid some of the objections people have raised.
Can I just to that, Edgar? If it was, that was my first thought, this dilemma there, either Fness, because it starts to be F, or Fness is primitively F, right? Going the first way, first form of the dilemma is regressive, because, then Fness is made to be F, by being caused to be F by something that is F, right? So that's the definition. Something that is primitively F, so then you fall in the second form of the dilemma. So, either way, I've not read them minor papers yet, but either way, I think there is a problem, unless they go for primitive. Fness is primitively F, but then the problem is to admit something that is not causally doing anything in the system. So I think they have a problem independently of Simon. It's not your problem, Simon. I think they have a problem.
Yeah, well, that's kind of like the Plotinus objection, right? I mean, there's and Simplicius, and all the Platonists are trying to say, what is the cause of pneuma being one thing, right? So it's fire and air. What makes that into one thing? Because it seems like there's a regress of unifiers. That's sort of a threat, and I think that's related to this question of regress of causation. They have a principled story about why the buck stops with pneuma.
Yeah, but then if you go to Plotinus, you can go to Aristotle, right? He told you that problem first, and so did Plato. So yeah, the Stoics should have learned their lesson. So it's that problem, not yours.
Okay.
Okay. Well, thanks a lot.
Thank you.